Be going and now.
Welcome everybody to the AE911Truth Webinar series. I am Andy Steele, and we're momentarily going to be joined by Richard Gage, who's just working out a few technical issues before the presentation begins. We're going to be talking about World Trade Center 7 today. This is the 47-story steel frame high-rise that fell on the day of 9/11 at 5:20 in the afternoon, and looking into some of the theories put forth by National Institute of Standards and Technologies, and how they measure up to the evidence that architects and engineers for 9/11 Truth has acquired through observing videos, looking at the official reports, and putting it through the scientific method. So while we're waiting for Richard to work out his technical issues, I just want to let everybody know a little bit about the organization AE911 Truth. Right now it represents over 2,400 architects and engineers who have signed a petition calling for a new investigation into the destruction of the building that we're going to be talking about today, World Trade Center 7, and the Twin Towers as well. The Twin Towers are going to be covered in later webinars as we've done. So we've gone through one cycle of webinars so far, and we're coming around again, beginning again with World Trade Center 7. As I typically say at the end of these webinars, I'll say it now. If you have watched these webinars, if you are moved by the evidence put forth by AE911 Truth, then we encourage you to tell other people about it. Find people, particularly even professional people, if you know architects, engineers, people in the building trades, scientists, somebody that would have an expert opinion to offer on this issue. Let them know that these webinars are happening twice a week. They're happening, of course, right now on Thursdays at 1 o'clock Pacific time, 4 o'clock Eastern time, and they also happen on Sundays at 4 o'clock Pacific time. So that translates to 7 o'clock Eastern. And typically we will be doing one subject a week. So if you miss it on a Thursday afternoon, you can catch it on Sunday. The same topic, but we like to do these webinars live because it gives an opportunity for the people watching to be interactive with us, to submit their questions to Richard, and we'll go over them. I'll be reading these questions, and what we try to do when you submit the questions to us is we try to stick to the topic that's being spoken about on that day. So for instance, today is World Trade Center 7, and we're going to ask that the questions that be submitted be about World Trade Center 7. Although there are many great questions about other aspects of what we saw on 9/11, the Twin Towers, extreme heat, we're going to be covering those on future webinars. So if you submit those questions, we may not get to them today. However, we may get to them at later times, and we encourage you to come to those later webinars to ask those questions. I also want to remind everybody that YouTube defaults to a low resolution often. So if you want to increase the resolution on your picture so you can see these images more clearly, you can just click the little gearbox at the bottom of the screen and select it to a 720 HD resolution. That'll help you again better to better see the presentation. I'm just going to do a quick check. Richard, how are you doing?
Let's rock and roll.
Okay. Without further ado, Richard Gage.
Welcome, everybody. As Andy said, you're with AE911 Truth Live, and we are looking at the World Trade Center Building 7 today. I'm an architect of 28 years, and I have some experience with steel frame buildings, and particularly these $3 and $10 million gymnasiums. I was working on this project, in fact, when I heard from David Ray Griffin about 10 years ago on the radio with KPFA's Guns and Butter here in Berkeley. I was just shocked to learn that there's all this evidence that we had not seen as professionals or the public, from the media, from our own associations, the American Institute of Architects, of which I'm a member, bought the official story, hook, line, and sinker, as I did for 4 years. And that changed on that fateful afternoon when I just had to pull my car over in the parking lot of the high school that I was working on. And this information turned my world upside down. I was a flag-waving Republican rooting for the war in Afghanistan and then Iraq, and boy, did I have a little bit of a wake-up call when I learned about the third worst structural failure in modern history that most architects and engineers know nothing about. That's, of course, Building 7. We're going to be talking about it today. But at that time, I was also working on the $125 million high school in the San Francisco Bay Area for construction administration. And then later, during the initial couple of years of my kind of awakening, we refer to it in the 9/11 truth movement. We learn more than we ever wanted to know. And we're going to start you off easy with Building 7. It was a high rise, but these are mid rises that you're looking at here. I worked on this $400 million project with retail and mid rise and parking structure, altogether about 1,200 tons of fireproof steel framing. And as have many of the other, now almost 2,500 architects and engineers demanding a new investigation of the destruction of these 3 skyscrapers on 9/11. Many of them, about 80 of them, are structural engineers, and we have many high-rise structural engineers and architects as well, high-rise architects. Now, there's a lot more information and resources for you on our website. Many of you are on our website. Some of you are not. It's AE911Truth.org, and you can get a lot of information here, as well as sign our petition demanding a new investigation. You don't have to be an architect or engineer. Anybody can sign. But there's a reason people are signing this petition, and it has to do with 9/11. And, of course, what happened on 9/11. There's a very important reason we're looking at this. Yes, it's 15 years ago that these buildings came down. Are we here simply because we don't know the truth about how these high rises came down? No, we're here because our society changed after 9/11. We've invaded 2 countries in which over 2 million people have perished, and of course 7,000 US soldiers, instituting a $4.5 trillion global war on terror. The legislation and executive orders that have reduced our civil liberties dramatically. Any of us can be arrested without charge, without a right to a lawyer, a trial, a jury, simply by being associated with terrorism, which is not defined. Of course, we have torture now as a part of our policy, which has jeopardized our reputation, and a whole lot of other major issues that have resulted since 9/11. All of this as a result of 9/11. If there's any question about what happened on 9/11, particularly at the heart of the 9/11 tragedy, the destruction of the skyscrapers, and of course the other issues surrounding 9/11, then we've got to look at it. We can't leave any stone unturned with all of this that has happened since. So yes, we're asking questions, and yes, we start with the most obvious, and that is Building 7. We're going to be looking at an overview today, starting with the scientific method, looking at evidence of explosions, whether office fires can bring down a building like this, the official cause of this building's collapse. We'll be looking at some evidence of extreme heat and foreknowledge. And we'll be looking at expert opinions as well. Now, we use the scientific method in our approach. We formulate a question. How did the towers come down? In this particular case, how did Building 7 come down? We do some background research. We make some observations. We construct a hypothesis. Now, that's our best guess as to how the towers came down. I think they came down by fire. Well, maybe they came down by explosions. We lay out all the hypotheses. We don't leave any of them out. We don't use our own personal agenda to focus in on one answer. to the exclusion of the others. That's the basis of science, objectivity. Now we can make some predictions based on those hypotheses, and we test them with experiments. If we analyze the results from those experiments, we draw conclusions. If the hypothesis is corroborated, we report the results in an open, transparent manner so all can build on the body of our evidence, of our conclusions that are based on solid science. Now, we're going to learn that NIST has not done this. In fact, they, as an example, they particularly will not release the information in their computer input data. It is like a black box. It's not open for public scrutiny. It's not peer reviewed. And you'll see the computer information, which the computer modeling which they did which was highly suspect. But let's say that your hypothesis is not corroborated. What do? Well, you go back, you construct a hypothesis that has a better chance, that stands up against the experimental data and the other work and the background research you've done. So with this in mind, we're going to apply the scientific method, and we're going to gather some data, which we'll find that NIST did not do either. Now, NIST is the National Institute of Standards and Technology. They were tasked by Congress to explain these collapses to the American people. So we're going to try to do some explanation of our own, starting with, well, how have other high-rises come down? And what does fire do to high-rises? You know, fire is an organic process. It burns out an area in 20 minutes or so. That's all the fuel that there is in that area, and it looks for fresh new fuel sources. So if a building is going to fall over, and you'll come to learn that no skyscraper has ever collapsed by fire, but say in a wood frame building, it'll fall in stages, gradually. If it's going to fall over, it'll fall to the path of least resistance where that fire is hottest, and it'll fall asymmetrically, of course. So this is very important for us in our effort to learn. And as I mentioned, there's so many fires that have not brought down skyscrapers. We have 3.5 hours over 5 floors in Los Angeles. In Philadelphia, 18-hour fire over 8 floors. And in Caracas, Venezuela, 17 hours over 26 floors these fires burned. Not one of them collapsed, though. They're all put back into use with some remodeling. These skyscrapers, or mid-rises in this case, did collapse. This is due to earthquake. It's a natural collapse. In natural collapses, again, buildings will fall over, not straight down through the path of greatest resistance. We see a building, we recognize it as a building. It's broken up, certainly, but its concrete is not pulverized to powder. Its structural steel elements are not dismembered from each other, or concrete in this case. Now, buildings can be destroyed by explosives as well. In this case, we have thick, billowing, enormous, pyroclastic-like clouds. This comes from the term volcanoes, where there's these incredible reactions from the massive heat produced, folding these clouds in cauliflower-shaped plumes with a thick, defined edge around. It's not diffuse like we see in controlled demolitions. Typical controlled demolitions. Park that piece of information in the back of your mind, because we're going to be looking at typical and non-typical controlled demolitions today. But in explosive destruction, we have witnesses that hear the sounds of explosions. They see the flashes of light. For instance, in a typical controlled demolition, explosives can be harnessed very nicely and placed in thousands of columns and beams throughout the building, and synchronized and set off in a deliberate order, usually from the bottom of the building up, although they can be also done, as you'll see, from the top down. There's only a handful of companies in the United States and around the world that can accomplish this. And it is the most common method of bringing high rises down. In fact, the only cause of high-rise failure ever. So it's not so difficult. You can see the diffuse clouds in all of these controlled demolitions. We don't have a thick defined edge. Why not? Well, we're going to learn that there's much, much more heat available at World Trade Center 7's destruction coming up here than we had available in these. But there are a typical set of features associated with these controlled demolitions, beginning with a sudden onset of destruction, usually at the base of the structure. A straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint. They don't fall over. This is because demolition waves remove those column supports and resulting in a free fall acceleration through the path of what was the greatest resistance and resulting in the total dismemberment of the steel structure. We want to break it up so it can be easily loaded and shipped. Minimal damage, of course, to adjacent structures is one of the goals. We hear sounds of explosions. Witnesses see flashes of light. And there's enormous clouds of pulverized concrete and pyroclastic-like clouds as well, as we saw. And squibs, explosive charges that appear to have been placed at floors that are quite easily seen as isolated explosive ejections. Squib is a term in the controlled demolition industry. Chemical evidence, of course, left behind of cutter charges, whether it's C4, RDX shaped charges, or some unique chemical evidence that we'll be looking at in the case of Building 7 and the Twin Towers as well when we get to them in week 3 and 4. This is all direct evidence of explosive destruction. Now, fire has not really been responsible for any one of these 10 key typical features, let alone all of them. So if you have all these features or any of them, you know you have direct evidence of explosive destruction. That's the kind of test we're going to be applying using the scientific method today in this webinar. If we have circumstantial evidence or corroborative evidence from governments, experts, and foreknowledge, of course. Regarding experts, we're looking for unbiased opinions, those who don't have $100,000 annual contracts with the federal government of the United States, might be a little more free with their opinions. Foreknowledge. These demolitions are set up months in advance, of course. You don't just bring down a building in an afternoon. So if people know about it, this is helpful in our proof of controlled demolition. Now, with this in mind, we're going to take a real close look here at Building 7. Some of you may not be that familiar with this building. I wasn't until 4 years after 9/11 did I find that a third skyscraper collapsed on 9/11, a 47-story skyscraper. This would be the tallest building in most of our states. It's huge. Each floor is the size of a football field. It wasn't hit by an airplane. So when we look at the destruction of this building, we can't. We're going to put away our associations with jet fuel and airplanes and hijackers. This is a very clean analysis that we're going to be looking at. This building was about a football field in length away from the North Tower, and it goes down at about 5:20 in the afternoon. In fact, you can see here that it's standing just fine when the Twin Towers went down that morning, about 7 hours later. This building collapses. We're going to look at that, and we're going to compare its features to the features of a typical controlled demolition, beginning with, is there a sudden onset of destruction at the base of the structure? Which doesn't occur except in controlled demolitions. Let's first listen to Daryl, a medical emergency worker here on site. Uh-oh. Andy, I got to get that sound working yet again. If you can help me out with some fill in what we're looking at here while I get that sound coming back.
Okay. As Richard was just saying, this is going to be an emergency worker that was on the site, and I don't have the exact quote in my mind here, but
Andy,
as
you
he's
there?
talking, can you hear me, Richard?
Andy? All right. Hang on, folks. I'm going to try to get this sound working for you. It was working just fine before.
Richard, can you hear me?
Okay. Default. There's Andy.
Oh, you can hear me now? Okay. All right. So as Richard was saying, as he gets the sound back on, he's going to be playing a clip from an emergency worker that was there on the scene. And there was many instances of people who were there reporting, things that like a shockwave ripping throughout the building, reports of explosions. This is the case of both towers. In fact, if the audience is interested in exploring this even more, there's a paper by Graham McQueen where he was documenting over 118 first responders who were reporting explosions on that morning. And he was very conservative with this study. So if somebody said they heard a boom or a bang or something like that, they didn't count that because that could be, that could be any number of things. So he looked for distinct words like explosion, and that is what he included in this study. So if you Google Graham McQueen 118 eyewitnesses, you should get that paper up. They were taken from the oral histories collected by the fire chief on that day. So if you want to explore that more. Okay, go ahead.
Here we go. Oh, man. It decides to work sometimes and not others. Oh, this is crazy. Let's do this, Andy. I'm going to... Let's do... Andy, I'm going to have to get that old microphone. Can you take over for a minute?
Sure. So as I was saying before, that paper exists. It's by Graham McQueen. You could look that up. I believe it might be at the Journal of 9/11 Studies. I'm not exactly sure, but that is a good journal for documenting a lot of the information in greater depth than we can even go over here on these presentations. So Journal of 9/11 Studies has a lot of good information there. You can also see these videos for yourself just by going on YouTube. There's people who have put together compilations reporting explosions on that morning. In fact, interestingly enough, there is a video that really stuck out for me of some firefighters on a payphone. If anybody remembers payphones, they're a little bit more rare these days, but they were on a payphone. And one firefighter is saying on the phone to whoever he's speaking to, "I'm okay," something to this effect. And then there's an explosion heard just off camera, but it's very distinct, very loud, and you can see the firefighters react to that. So these are all accounts that should have been taken into consideration by National Institute of Standards and Technology if they were to do a full investigation. And when you do a full investigation, you got to look at all of the data. You can't simply omit things that don't fall into the preconceived notions or whatever hypothesis you're trying to prove. You have to look at every bit of information that comes. That includes releasing the input data and making that available for review too. Richard commented on that earlier of how the input data for the Building 7 models are not being released because of public safety concerns cited by NIST. So the problem with this is that architects and engineers need this information in order to make buildings a lot safer. Because if you believe the official story of what happened to World Trade Center 7, what this means then is that some thermally expanding beams can push a girder off of its seat and bring a building down in 7 seconds. So if this is true, firefighters are in danger. I realize that there were no firefighters in the building at the time Building 7 came down. However, because they had been pulled out, twin towers had just been brought down, and I can understand that they'd be very concerned about that.
And here we go.
Oh, you're back. Okay. So, but if firefighters were in a building fighting these very fightable fires in the future, in a steel frame high rise, we have a public safety concern presented by the official story that we have to deal with then. And that's why the input data should be released. So I'm going to hand it over to Richard again.
Thanks, Andy. And let's take a look at Daryl, this emergency student, regarding evidence of our initial evidence of controlled demolition here.
We were watching the building actually because it was on fire. The bottom floors of the building were on fire, and you know, we heard this sound that sounded like a clap of thunder. Turned around, we were shocked to see that the building was well, it looked like there was a shock wave ripping through the building, and the windows all busted out, and you know, it was horrifying. And then you know, about a second later, the bottom floor caved out, and the building followed after that, and we saw the building crash down all the way to the ground. You know, we were in shock, and then the worst part.
The building crashed all the way down to the ground after he heard a sound of a clap of thunder, and then windows busting out. Fascinating. Well, let's listen to Dan Rather describe this for us on national television before he seemed to have been not speaking about this ever again after this.
What you're seeing are high shots. Now, here we're going to show you a videotape of the collapse itself. Now we go to videotape, the collapse of this building. It's amazing. Amazing, incredible, pick your word. For the third time today, it's reminiscent of those pictures we've all seen too much on television before, when a building was deliberately destroyed by world-class dynamite to knock it down.
Yeah, we would like to have had Dan repeat that again after 9/11, but not. In fact, we haven't seen Building 7 come down on mainstream media, even though it is the third worst structural failure in modern history. Let's see if we have a straight down symmetrical collapse into the building's footprint. Here's from West Street. Pretty straight down, pretty symmetrical. This is direct evidence of a controlled demolition. Let me ask you, look at the penthouse and the screen wall. It drops suddenly and symmetrically, also a half a second prior to the building's collapse. This is really important. It indicates the core column damage underneath that in the area of the elevator shafts. This is indicative of a timing sequence that completely violates the NIST theory, as we'll look at it in more depth tomorrow, that says the collapse started on one side of the building and then traveled across the building. That's not happening here. Let me put Building 7 on the left, though, and a controlled demolition on the right. And you tell me, is there any similarity? Is there enough similarity to warrant an investigation into the possible use of explosives, especially since it looks exactly like one, especially since fire has never brought down a skyscraper before, especially in the exact manner of a controlled demolition? But NIST focuses solely and exclusively on the hypothesis of destruction by fire. And it took them 7 years to come out with their final report. You delay a report long enough, and people will forget about what it is you were even reporting about. And that's what happened. The American Institute of Architects had very little comment after the 7-year period during which NIST was fumbling with this football. And in fact, they never had an official a comment on the final report as well. Let's look at those fires that are said to have brought this building down. These are the worst fires that we have photographic or video evidence of. They're few, small, and scattered. This on the 12th and 13th floor, which we'll be taking a greater look at tomorrow. And in fact, those fires on the 12th and 13th floor, here shown at about 3 o'clock, will be shown to have been out. We'll look at that in more detail next week. by the time the collapse began at 5:20, actually an hour before that. How do we bring a building straight down into its own footprint? Well, we have to remove those column supports. In fact, all of them at once. The question is, can fire do that? Now, NIST's theory, that we will get into again next week, begins with column 79, or the fires around column 79, and they highlight that's where the initiation collapse began, and then it traveled, the instability traveled vertically because of the collapse of this column, and then laterally across the building. And you can see that if clearly a child can see this, that if that were to happen, the building would fall over toward its weakened side. Well, how fast is the building coming down? It's as if 8 stories were removed from this building all at once. It is free fall acceleration. The building is accelerating as fast as a bowling ball that's freely falling off the side of the building. In fact, we'll look at that in more depth next week with an analysis from David Chandler, a physics teacher, who makes it very clear what's happening in a computer study that he did. Do we have the total dismemberment of the steel structure? Well, we had a 47-story moment-resisting steel frame building that has collapsed to a pile only 6 or so stories tall. It's as if every, like a house of cards, every column and every beam connection had to have been severed in order for this to happen. And that's consistent with the free fall. It's consistent with the symmetry. And the pile reveals that. Remember, buildings that fall due to natural causes don't completely dismember their steel or concrete structure. We see a building at the bottom. Do we have witnesses that heard sounds of explosions? Here's Kevin McPadden, a former Air Force medic, and he was a first responder on the site. What did he hear?
And then it was like another 2-3 seconds. You heard explosions, like boom. There's like a distinct sound. It's not like when the compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was a boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something. That, to me, I knew that was an explosion. There was no doubt in my mind.
That's very helpful information.
I'm going to call in Bill Rosati. He was here when it all happened. He saw it for himself. Bill, if you could just tell us what you saw, what you heard.
I was standing like 2 blocks away, and all of a sudden I just seen a big flash, and then I seen the building coming down, and I just seen people just running everywhere, chaotic like.
When we got to the 8th floor, I started walking to one side of the building. That side of the building was gone. The first explosion I heard when I was on the stairwell landing, when we made it down to the 6th floor. Then we made it back to the 8th floor. I heard some more explosions.
What's the sound?
Like a boom. Like an explosion.
More than one?
Yes. We started walking down the stairs. We made it to the 8th floor. Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. When we get outside, a police officer comes to me and says, you have to run. We have more information of bombs, so you have to run.
Well, all of this information and of bombs and the eyewitnesses' testimony of explosions, and in fact, this explosion, which is actually caught on video, none of these appear in the final or the draft reports of NIST. Why not? Watch this.
Yeah, here's one of the guys who can tell you I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
Why would they omit direct evidence of explosions like this that occurred in the late afternoon in 9/11? Interesting. Enormous pyroclastic-like clouds. Let's take a look because the National Fire Protection Association produced the guide for fire and explosion investigations under the help of NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, but NIST did not follow These guidelines, they do in fact suggest that we look for direct evidence of large volumes of gas and large amount of heat released in chemical explosions. Well, we have such plumes that are directly observable after and during the explosive destruction of this building. In fact, racing away every direction, 35 miles an hour, these thick, unfolding plumes of extreme heat, much more heat than was available, as is evidenced here, than we had in that building in those small scattered fires. And we'll be looking for chemical evidence of cutter charges next week, in fact. But this is all so far direct evidence of explosive destruction. And guess what? Again, fire hasn't really and can't, in our opinion, account for any one of these. Fires like these can bring down a building. This is a huge engulfing fire in building number 5. If any of these skyscrapers, or in this case a mid-rise, were to come down due to fire, we'd expect it to be this one. Did it? No. Fireproof steel frame buildings don't collapse due to fire. Not even in China, where we had this 2009 fire burning on every floor, top to bottom, fully engulfed. And this building did not collapse. On the right, you see afterward, before the building, you see on the left, it's being remodeled and will be put back into use. And yet, relatively small random fires brought this building down in 6.5 seconds into a pile just a few stories tall, 5-6 stories tall. Well, what does FEMA say? FEMA did an initial investigation early on. They had very little funding, if any, in the case of Building 7. They say the specifics of the fires in World Trade Center 7 and how they caused the building to collapse remain unknown at this time. Wait a minute, you don't know how the building collapsed? Well, our best hypothesis, fire and random damage, then complete collapse, has only a low probability of occurrence. Wait a minute, what do you do when your best hypothesis has a low probability of occurrence? You go back and you find another one that has a higher probability of occurrence. But they do say further investigation and research analysis are needed to resolve this issue. Wow, we agree. Unfortunately, though, as Bill Manning here, editor-in-chief of Fire Engineering magazine, says, crucial evidence that could answer many questions is on the slow boat to China, showing an astounding ignorance of government officials to the value of a thorough scientific investigation. The destruction and removal of evidence must stop immediately. But it didn't. In fact, 400 trucks were taking away the structural steel every day. In the case of Building 7, within weeks, 2 weeks after 9/11. This is the steel, the evidence that could let us know, engineers, forensic structural engineers, what brought this building down. Well, what do the experts say? Here's a top controlled demolition expert, Danny Jawenko, in Europe. He says it starts from below. They've simply blown away the columns. It's a controlled demolition. A team of experts did this. Professional work, without any doubt. That's very helpful information. But did people know about the destruction of this building before it happened? Well, here's some construction workers walking away from Building 7, hearing an explosion, looking back over their shoulder at the building, and then looking straight into the CNN camera and saying this.
Keep your eye on that building, it's coming down. Building is about to blow up. Move it back.
All right, guys. We are walking back. It's a building about to blow up. On flame, debris coming down.
The building is about to blow up. What is causing a building that has a few small fires to blow up, and how do they know it's about to blow up? And remember Kevin McPadden, who previously witnessed this to curing explosions. The earlier part of his story is that he was held about 6 blocks away along with others because they were expecting this building to come down, and he is listening to a radio held in the hands of a Red Cross worker, and this is what he hears.
At the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
Wait, do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? This is extraordinary, and every one of these witnesses are alone enough cause for a reinvestigation of this building, as is the reporting that BBC did 20 minutes before the building came down. They report that the building 7 came down, and they even have the reason why. They said due to structural weakening when the towers went down. Wait a minute. The building didn't even come down. No high-rise has ever come down due to fire or structural weakening for that matter. How do they know? Well, they apologize for this grievous error, citing the confusing events of the day. Wow. But CNN announces the collapse of this building earlier. Listen.
In New York, Alan Dodd-Frank joins us on the phone in Lower Manhattan. Alan?
Alan, just 2 or 3 minutes ago, there was yet another collapse or explosion. I'm now out of sight. A Good Samaritan has taken me in on Duane Street. But at 11:15, there was another collapse or explosion following the 10:30 collapse of the second tower. And a firefighter who rushed by us estimated that 50 stories went down. The street filled with smoke. It was like a forest fire roaring down a canyon. Now, as I think Patty Sadby and others have told you.
Wow, 50 stories went down. Well, no other 50-story building went down. No other building went down on whole at all. He's referring, of course, to building 7, which doesn't go down for another 7 hours or so. You know, had this building 7 come down at that time in the morning, we wouldn't even have videos of it. It would have been completely obscured by the massive dust cloud released when the Twin Towers went down. So some researchers suggest that, or speculate that it was supposed to go down at that time, and that these construction workers walking away from building 7 who knew the building was about to blow up may have been fixing it. That's all speculation, of course. But aside from that, which is very interesting, and you know, we need to know when we're speculating versus looking at scientific evidence. Is the hypothesis corroborated with the scientific evidence that we've shown of controlled demolition for you? That's an important question. And of course, this is just a preliminary overview. We're going into depth next week, and we also have some very good DVDs for you to follow up on, as we'll show you. But do we have the first 8 so far in this webinar series? Key characteristic features of controlled demolition. Can fire create any one of those, let alone all 10 of them? Is there additional circumstantial or corroborative evidence from these other sources? Is this to you proof of controlled demolition beyond a reasonable doubt? If so, I encourage you to think further about the implications of this controlled demolition, because this is a very highly secure building. After all, we have the CIA undercover New York station in there, the Secret Service, the IRS, the Department of Defense is in there, and Mayor Giuliani's Office of Emergency Management, which was a very, very expensive bunker on the 23rd floor designed to run the city in the event of any major emergency. On the 12th and 13th floor, the source of the worst fires in this building, we have the Securities and Exchange Commission, which lost thousands of files and sources of evidence that it was using to pursue hundreds of case Wall Street companies and other companies like Enron and WorldCom. So we certainly want an investigation of those fires, which we certainly have some suspicions about. The question, of course, is who would have access to this building in order to set these explosives or incendiaries, as we'll come to find out next week, seem to have been used. Is Al-Qaeda responsible for this? We don't know. We need a real investigation. We're not criminal investigators. You know, we're not investigative journalists. Somebody needs to step up and do their job on this end. We have the evidence that proves that we have not biased by our government, by the media, and that's our effort, is to educate the public. And you can help us do that. Work with us. Sign our petition. Take a stand. It's right there on the website down below. And become a member of AE911Truth for as little as $2.50 a month, which we can all afford. You can help by becoming hundreds and thousands of us who are gathered together to pool our resources to help AE911Truth, the tip of the spear by many opinion of many of the effort to really go after the Achilles heel of those who brought us 9/11, and wherever and whoever they are. We need to do a major outreach, and we are going, for instance, to Philadelphia, the site of the American Institute of Architects National Convention, where we have a booth 10 feet by 10 feet full of our evidence, full of video of Building 7 coming down. We were able to educate hundreds of architects last year, and thousands will see actually the building coming down, who at least 1,000 walking by our booth. And we'll have on the floor of the annual business meeting 400 top level managers of the AIA in a debate, which amounts to about 10 minutes of this annual business meeting time, where they're forced to look at Building 7 coming down. They're forced to listen to the evidence. The evidence is actually on the resolution that they'll be having to vote on, and we're very hopeful this year. Every year we make a bigger dent, and so you can also support that effort by donating, and that's key effort. I mean, it actually costs us $20,000, $5,000 just for the booth, and all the other expenses to get us there, to get our top level AIA members there to represent us appropriately. And you can volunteer also. There are so many things you can do. Andy, you have some ways people can help us right here at AE911Truth, right?
Absolutely. If you are moved by this evidence, you want to do more to share it with others in an organized way, you can do so by volunteering with AE911Truth. To volunteer, all you need to do is go to the What You Can Do tab at the top of AE911Truth.org, the page you're watching this on right now. And then a bunch of options will come up. One of them is to volunteer. So you click that and you fill out a form with some basic contact info, some of the things you're interested in doing, envision yourself helping out with. And we got a number of projects going on right now that are having a big impact, reaching a lot of people, professional people, and people in government as well. So we'll go into further detail with you once you volunteer, but we need all the help we can get.
Thanks, Andy. And we definitely do. We've got a lot of work to do. And right from your own computers, you can also demand a new investigation. You can write your elected representatives, television stations, send them the links to AE911Truth, and your local radio and newspapers as well. Write a letter to the editor. Send the AE911Truth.org link to every architect and engineer you can find and everybody else that you know. You can screen our DVDs. I'm going to show you the best one right here in a moment. But you can also speak to new audiences. You can show this in your living room or at the local library. Share these resources one-on-one. One of the best ones is our new 50-page booklet, which has been distributed about 40,000 different places, 20,000 just to architects and engineers, academics in their field. We had a massive effort to get this out, and our supporters, like you, supported this project with your donations. That's how it happened. You need to follow up and get informed. And here's one way you can do it with our DVD 9/11 Explosive Evidence Experts Speak Out, in which we went around the country, actually around the world, getting the testimony from 40 of our top high-rise architects, structural engineers, metallurgists, chemists, physicists, controlled demolition experts, all laying out the evidence. Here's just a taste for you.
I don't want to be involved in conspiracy theories. You know, there are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
To undermine scientific integrity is to undermine our democracy.
This is what NIST has done, denied and ignored crucial evidence.
The American people absolutely need the truth of 9/11.
More than 1,500 architects and engineers and 12,000 others, including many scientists, have signed the petition calling for a scientific investigation of the destruction of the Twin Towers and World Trade Center Building 7. The report, issued by the National Institute of Standards and Technology, referred to as NIST, was not valid science.
They're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building.
Building number 7 descended in free fall for the first 100 feet, which means that there was absolutely no resistance to descent whatsoever.
So all of the columns really needed to be severed at the same time.
The symmetry is the smoking gun.
NIST has admitted it went into free fall for 8 stories.
You don't need to be an engineer or an architect to see what happened to those buildings.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten.
What I saw was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it.
NIST excluded the documents from FEMA in Appendix C that documented the evidence of melting steel.
In an office fire, you cannot generate enough heat to melt steel.
There were these iron microspheres present in all of the dust samples. They needed to have been formed in extremely high temperatures.
All the characteristics of the microspheres, along with what I see in the attack of the beams that were actually found, tell me that thermite was involved. In the dust, what we have found is a modern version of thermite, which we call nanothermite.
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
And in fact, the evidence is overwhelming that these red-grade crystals are very high-temperature incendiaries.
And we have watched as scientific integrity has been undermined and scientific research politicized in an effort to advance predetermined ideological agendas.
If this is a crime, I think everybody agrees it's a crime. Evidence was removed from the scene of the crime. You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. And the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science.
Yes, organize the screening because it really is that good. I've been deeply impressed with the results when people see this film. In fact, we've showed the film in 33 states when it premiered, and do it by a show of hands. We have almost no one, and usually no one, agreeing with the official story anymore, and many times no one unsure about what happened either. It's extraordinary. And that's the case also with our Northwest tour, which we're underway with right now in we've just completed Seattle, Portland, and Spokane, Washington. And we've by a show of hands, before and after our latest film, which is called Firefighters, Architects, Engineers Expose 9/11 Myths, in which Eric Lawyer is featured. He founded Firefighters for 9/11 Truth and Unity. And he comes from the firefighter perspective, the violations by NIST of the National Fire Protection Association manual that we talked about earlier, very much detail. You've got to get a hold of this DVD as well. And if you're on our tour circuit, we're heading to Idaho and Montana this week and next week, and then we will start a new tour in late May and early June in the Southeast United States, and then in the first 2 weeks of July in the Midwest, and the first 2 weeks of August in Canada. So we don't have those dates yet for the Southeast, Midwest, or Canada to give you, but tune in, stay tuned, and we'll definitely get you on board. And at this time, I'm sure that we have some great questions from our audience, don't we, Andy?
Absolutely. The first one that I have here is, who was the Chinese company that hauled and/or received the steel? Has anyone ever made an inquiry to that Chinese company to check as to whether or not some or all of the WTC steel may still exist?
Well, no, we don't know that. That would be a great piece of research by an investigative journalist. I'm just guessing that it won't yield much fruit because of all of the bureaucracy and the agendas of the people that you're likely to come across in attempting to pursue such information. Do you have any other insight on that one, Andy?
Simply the same thing. A lot of this investigation, we're doing our best to look at all of the scientific aspects surrounding this event and to follow these corners, but a lot of the movement that we're a part of has been built grassroots from people taking the initiative and doing independent journalism and blogging about it. So I would recommend that anybody who has a lead on these things, you can certainly contact us. Our contact information is on the website, and facts are more important than speculation. That's what we're interested in, is the hard facts, and any information that anyone out there is able to gather to send it on to us.
Right on.
Okay, Richard, our next question is, do you know what time WTC-7 was fully evacuated?
We understand from official sources that it was evacuated after the second plane hit the towers, and we knew as a country that we were under attack, and that's when later on we have Barry Jennings and Michael Hess, the attorney for Mayor Giuliani, had gone up in the building, not realizing that it was evacuated, and they got all the way up to the 23rd floor and found hot coffee still hot up there. So they were up there soon after the evacuation, apparently, and then that's when they both experienced explosions in the building, blowing them around inside the building. In a different part of the building that was on fire. Obviously, they weren't going through fires or burning up or experiencing smoke, a lot of smoke inhalation and so forth.
Okay, the next question asks, did NIST elaborate on what public safety risk would be created if they release the computer info?
Well, there is an out for government agencies. When they decide not to release information that is requested through the Freedom of Information Act, or FOIA, they can either release it or they can they can cite one of several reasons that they have available. One, of course, is if it's national security, it can't be released. If it would jeopardize public safety, that is another reason. So they simply cited that reason. They didn't make it up. They used a pre-existing out that had been given to them. So they didn't clarify exactly why it would jeopardize public safety. Of course, how can it jeopardize public safety to release the information as to the destruction of this building to the architects and engineers who are insured who are tasked with ensuring the public safety? So it's pretty ludicrous, their reasoning here.
Okay, our next question asks, has anyone ever adjusted the soundtrack on WTC collapse videos to reflect the difference between the speed of sound and the speed of light? And then asks the speed of sound. I think that's just a typo, but between the speed of sound and the speed of light. The eyewitness testimony about explosions preceding the collapse makes more sense when the video reflects that scenario. So they're asking if the speed of sound and speed of light have ever been coordinated in videos.
Yeah, right, because sound does travel slower than what we can see visually. But even so, consider this. There's, in the case of the Twin Towers particularly, where we have a large visual series of explosions, they actually heard that first. Even though sound travels slower than what they're seeing, they describe these sounds of explosions, and then debris is flying everywhere, to quote one of them, and then you have these lateral expulsions. It's 60 miles an hour laterally, landing 600 feet in every direction out of the Twin Towers. So we don't have to correlate them because the very witnesses are correlating them themselves.
Okay, our next question asks, do you know of any changes to firefighting procedures or building codes as a result of Building 7 falling down?
NIST made a number of recommendations for the change in the International Building Code as a result of the collapse of these towers, and yet none of their structural changes were made in the codes. So here we have, particularly in the case of Building 7, which wasn't hit by a plane, no jet fuel, normal office fires is the official reason for this building's collapse due to thermal expansion of long span beams, which we'll look at in more detail next week. But I was right in the middle of that point. Andy, just repeat that question. I gotta get backtracked. Andy, repeat that question.
Sure, sorry. The question asked if there was any changes to the firefighting procedures or building codes as a result of Building 7 going down.
So we don't have any changes to the actual codes that would keep a building from falling at free fall due to normal office fires. There were some changes, particularly due to exiting and more adhesion for fire protection, the cementitious fire coating, but because the concept in the Twin Towers was that the airplane shock not of the impact knocked off fireproofing in the area where it impacted. Of course, we don't have such impacts in Building 7. So this was never addressed in Building 7. In fact, there are tests that have been done, as we'll look at next week, in an 8-story mock building where some of the beams, steel beams, were fireproof, some were not. They set 2,000-degree fires in there to find out what would happen. There was no failure, just sagging of these beams.
Our next question asks, do you have any comments on the fire in the tower in Dubai this year?
Well, we have a skyscraper, several, in fact, in the last couple of years, that have been massive from floor to to the top of from the ground to the top in some of them, and none of them have failed. And with each example, we hope it's a little more wake-up call to cause some suspicion in and of itself about the failure of 3 skyscrapers on 9/11 due to fire. Because remember, the Twin Towers were substantially a fire-induced collapse. The impacts only took out some columns, but the building stayed up. The jet fuel burned up mostly outside the Twin Towers, and 10 minutes later, the rest of that jet fuel was burned up. It was just normal office fires after that. In fact, they were beginning to go out, particularly in the case of the South Tower, when that building went down, after witnesses heard explosions and saw explosions.
And I'm just going to comment, a member of the AE staff just forwarded me something from the Department of Commerce, which oversees NIST, when Ron Brookman tried to appeal that citing of public safety to refuse to disclose the input data. The DOC said, if released, these models might provide instruction to groups and individuals that wish to learn how to simulate building collapse and devise ways to destroy buildings. Therefore, although the buildings to which this information pertains no longer exist, the information contained in the withheld files is sufficiently detailed that it could be used to develop plans to destroy other similarly constructed buildings. So essentially, the DOC says that terrorists could start a fire in a building and bring it down. So by their logic, you don't need to learn how to do controlled demolitions and study that. You can just start some random fires in a steel frame building, start your own demolition business by doing this, and watch the building come down. So I just wanted to make sure that everybody got to hear that.
Yeah, that's a new business for people. They could start their own company and bring buildings down much more cheaply by setting some fires in them. But no, that's great information, Andy. I was aware that NIST was using, and the DOC, the excuse that revealing this computer input data could aid terrorists, but it's just so ludicrous I didn't even consider mentioning it.
Our final question asks about the Alaskan study. It says, what do you hope to do with the results of your Alaskan study once it's finished?
Yeah, for those of you who don't know, we have hired the University of Alaska in our largest, most important project ever. And that is a $215,000 computer dynamic analysis of World Trade Center Building 7. We're doing that which NIST did not do, an objective look at modeling this building. We're going to set very hot fires on floors 10, 12, and 13. That is to say, we've hired an independent, one of the top structural forensic engineers in the country, Leroy Halsey. So we've hired him to show what could or couldn't bring this building down. And he is underway 6 months into this 2-year study, maybe 8 months now. And we need everybody to support it, by the way. There's a $12,000 a month bill that we are continuing to fundraise for. And so this is, if this is of particular importance to you, then we want you to help us, because, to answer the question now, we expect that this study will turn over. Well, first of all, we'll put Building 7 in the public arena, at least the academic and professional arena, where a study with the scrutiny and the credibility that it has will alert a whole lot of engineers and architects to the third worst structural failure in modern history that most of them don't even know, first of all, but then to re-examine the official story, they'll realize, hey, this building couldn't have come down, and they've just proven it, because we expect them to prove it. I mean, we don't know, it's an independent study, but it will be peer reviewed in major publications, and there'll be a huge marketing effort to get this into the the sphere of influence of professionals and academic communities. I think it'll turn it around. So, we have another a year plus to go. It's a huge effort, and so please do support us, because we do expect it to make major shockwaves through the academic community.
And I'm just going to add that if you're intrigued by this study, if it's the first time that you're ever hearing of it, you can go to WTC7evaluation.org to learn more. Leroy Halsey does video blogs occasionally with his PhD students talking about the nitty-gritty details of putting together this study. So WTC7evaluation.org. I just want to thank everybody for coming to this webinar, all the great supportive comments and questions coming in. We love talking to our supporters and all the people who are already aware of this information, but we also equally love reaching out to people who are not aware of this information. So as I said earlier, if you are moved by this evidence, you think other people should be watching this, somebody who's not familiar with it, particularly people in professional building trades industry, reach out to them, send them the link, tell them the schedule. It's every Thursday at 1 Pacific, 4 Eastern, and then Sundays at 4 Pacific, 7 Eastern. We're going to be covering World Trade Center 7 again on Sunday, and be a chance for somebody who may not have heard this information before to watch the same presentation and submit their own questions. So remember that moving forward, and forward the link wherever you can.
Very good. Are there any other questions, Andy?
Nope, that's it.
All right. Well, thanks, everybody. We're delighted to address you today, and I hope you'll share the archive of the video with friends. And there are archives of each of the past all 4 weeks now on YouTube and down below on our website. And catch up on what you might have missed, or stay tuned. We meet every Thursday at 1 p.m. and every Sunday at 4 p.m. This is Pacific time. That's Thursday 4 p.m. Eastern and 7 p.m. on Sunday Eastern. So we'll catch up with you then. And until then, get the word out, the information. We need to educate everybody in order to in order to deal effectively with the implications of 9/11, as we started out this webinar looking at. This is not just about buildings. There are policies and expenses that are unimaginable in their change in our society. And so this is the way to accomplish the real work that we all must be about as American citizens. Thanks again, and we will see you on Sunday. Bye-bye.